Right, so Taiwan likes to see itself reflected in Israel, a besieged little democracy, plucky, resilient, and forever proving its right to exist against a hostile giant. In their case, China, just as Israel claims to be surrounded by hostile Arab forces. It is a flattering comparison, rehearsed endlessly in Taipei speeches and Washington talking points. Yet if Taiwan were honest with itself, it would recognise its true mirror image not in Tel Aviv but in Gaza, and other people denied recognition, menaced by a larger neighbour, struggling simply to exist. That irony alone would be enough. But the story grows sharper still, because what Taiwan insists on seeing itself in Israel is in Somaliland that their paths have fatally crossed. Israel and the United States imagine Somaliland as a convenient dumping ground for Palestinians driven from Gaza, a place so desperate for recognition itself that it might accept human lives as bargaining chips potentially. And yet it was Taiwan, Israel's supposed friend, that got there first. By planting its flag in Hargeisa, pouring in aid and signing security deals, Taiwan has made Somaliland far less pliable for Israel now. Trying to affirm its own existence, Taiwan has, by accident, blown up Israel's grotesque relocation plans in their faces. Right, so the catastrophe unfolding in Gaza since October 2023 has forced the international community to confront, once again, the brutal logic at the core of Israeli state policy, the displacement and elimination of the Palestinian people. Independent Israeli human rights groups such as B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel have described the campaign as genocidal, and rightly so. Many other organisations have too. Whilst international legal experts have pointed to the deliberate use of starvation and bombardment to make Gaza uninhabitable. Israel's strategy is laid bare by the rubble of hospitals, the famine pervading the entire strip, and the deliberate blockading of aid. Has nothing to do with suppressing Hamas, but to erase Gaza as a viable home for all Palestinians. Yet genocide, as history grimly reminds us, raises not only moral but logistical questions for its perpetrators too. What is to be done with this population if it is to be driven en masse from its homes, as Israel wants to do? Well, as we know, investigations last year and this year as well have revealed that Washington and Tel Aviv have been canvassing African states about the possibility of absorbing Palestinians displaced from Gaza, find a new home for them on the African continent. Governments in Somalia and Sudan and South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo and Somaliland as well have allegedly been approached. Palestinians, after enduring bombardment and famine and genocide, were being treated as if they were excess cargo to be exported, a surplus population to be shipped abroad like some sort of an unwanted commodity. Amongst the potential relocation sites, Somaliland for one stood out. Though unrecognised by the international community, it has functioned as a de facto independent state since 1991, with its own elections, own institutions, and its own armed forces. For US and Israeli planners, Somaliland's ambiguous status and its desperate need for recognition made it an ideal candidate for this kind of transactional diplomacy, a host for displaced Palestinians in return for international acknowledgement or aid. Yet here in the Horn of Africa, their scheme has collided with an unexpected obstacle, as it turns out. Because since 2020, Taiwan, itself unrecognised by much of the world under Beijing's One China policy, has cultivated deepening ties with Somaliland, establishing mutual representative offices and investing in aid and scholarships, and most recently signing a maritime security agreement just last month. That one of Israel's own friends, not its foes, may have ruined its most desperate plan raises something of a deeper question here. How could such a thing happen? Well, let's set the scene to answer this, shall we? Somaliland emerged from the ruins of Somalia's civil war as a functioning political entity in its own right, declaring independence all the way back in 1991 after the fall of Siad Barre's dictatorship. Since then, it has held elections, built institutions, and maintained relative stability compared to Mogadishu's chaos. Yet no state formally recognises it, with the African Union wary of legitimising secession and fearful of setting a precedent for other separatist movements. Somaliland's unrecognised status has left it in a liminal state, therefore, functioning and autonomous, yet perpetually vulnerable to being exploited. Strategically, though, Somaliland is something of a prize. Situated at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, its coastline looks directly across to Yemen and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's most vital trade choke points, as the Houthis of Yemen have made very clear to Israel already. Control of this corridor matters enormously to regional and global powers, therefore. The United Arab Emirates has invested in Berbera port, seeking a logistics hub and potential military presence. China has established its first overseas military base in Djibouti, just up the coast, just next door to Somaliland, in fact. The United States also maintains forces in Djibouti, wary of Beijing's expansion there. For Israel, though, Somaliland has been seen as both a potential strategic ally and, more disturbingly, a potential dumping ground too. The Jerusalem Post, for instance, reported last year that Israeli strategists were interested in Somaliland as a foothold to monitor Red Sea shipping and counter the Houthi movement in Yemen. But in parallel, Somaliland was also named in US and Israeli relocation overtures to African governments. The logic was purely transactional, though. Somaliland, desperate for recognition, might accept Palestinians in exchange for international legitimacy. The plan, however, revealed both grotesque cynicism and political ignorance, though. Somaliland has a population of roughly 4.5 million people, and fragile clan-based institutions at that. Hosting even a fraction of Gaza's 2 million people, increasing the population by 50% roughly, would destabilise what is already a not particularly stable state. Somalia, which still claims Somaliland as its territory, would fiercely oppose such a move, and the African Union would not recognise it because of that. Even before Taiwan's presence, the relocation scheme was implausible, therefore. But with Taiwan's active engagement, it became impossible. The idea of exporting Palestinians is not a new one. It's a dark thread woven throughout Israeli history, all the way back to when it was founded back in 1948. During the Nakba, more than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes in what Israeli leaders euphemistically called population transfer. This was not incidental wartime chaos, but a systematic campaign. Prime Minister Moshe Sheret's diaries spoke frankly of the need to remove the Arabs to secure a Jewish state. In later decades, this thinking persisted. Ariel Sharon in the 1980s floated plans to move Palestinians into Jordan. In 2004, one of his advisors suggested Gaza's population might be pushed into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Each scheme reflected the same underlying conviction: the Palestinian presence is a problem, and it needs to be solved by displacement. The 2024-2025 outreach to African states, therefore, fits this continuity. The Associated Press reported that US and Israeli officials canvassed governments about accepting Palestinians. The Financial Times confirmed Congo's involvement. Somaliland was one of the candidates. The notion of shipping traumatized Gazans to the Horn of Africa, treating them as surplus lives to be warehoused elsewhere, was both grotesque and revealing. It showed that Israel's genocide was not only about destruction within Gaza, but also about imagining new geographies of Eurasia and the seizure of their lands for Israel. It's against this background that Taiwan's presence matters. In August 2020, Taiwan opened a representative office in Hargeisa, and Somaliland opened one in Taipei the following month. This was the first time Somaliland had such an office in East Asia, anywhere. So the symbolism was pretty powerful, therefore. We had two unrecognised democracies here recognising each other in practice. Taiwan's motives were quite obvious. They were the same as everyone else with an interest in the Middle East. Somaliland offers a foothold on the Red Sea, a counter to China's base next door in Djibouti, and access to untapped resources. Symbolically, Somaliland mirrors Taiwan's own struggle for recognition. Both claim functioning democracy, both are excluded from the United Nations, both operate under threat from more powerful neighbours. A report in The Cradle described Taiwan's decision to plant its flag in Somaliland as a deliberate poke at Beijing, but actually it doesn't help Israel's deportation plans either, though from a US standpoint, poking China in the eye might be worth Israel's loss here. Since 2020, the relationship between Taiwan and Somaliland has deepened, though. Taiwan's International Cooperation and Development Fund has sent agricultural experts, medical missions and scholarships. In July of this year, Somaliland's Foreign Minister Essa Cade signed a Coast Guard and Maritime Security Agreement with President Lai in Taipei. The agreement pledged training, equipment and joint maritime surveillance. President Lai spoke of shared democratic resilience, and Essa Cade called Taiwan a brother nation. So this was no longer symbolic then, this was concrete cooperation here. For Somaliland, Taiwan provides not only aid but recognition. For Taiwan, Somaliland is a partner in its global campaign to defy its own isolation. So this partnership strengthens Somaliland's bargaining power and therefore makes it less vulnerable to Israeli or American manipulation as a result. So here's where the irony becomes acute. Taiwan has gone out of its way to show support for Israel since October 2023, donating more than $500,000 worth of supplies and condemning Hamas's attacks. Taiwanese officials drew parallels between Israel's situation and Taiwan's own under Chinese threat. And yet Taiwan's Somaliland diplomacy has blown up Israel's relocation plan. Israel wanted Somaliland to be pliable, to be desperate enough to trade land for legitimacy. Taiwan wanted Somaliland stable, visible, and tied into its democratic narrative. So the agendas have collided head-on here. Taiwan's engagement empowered Somaliland, giving it an alternative source of recognition. That empowerment made the relocation scheme implode before it could even be negotiated. The collision is doubly awkward for Israel, actually. Israel formally recognises China, not Taiwan, keeping China on side, seeks to avoid antagonising Beijing, even if China is very much calling Israel out for its actions, its genocide in Gaza. If Somaliland is now branded as a Taiwanese ally, though, Israeli involvement risks entanglement in that Taiwan-China dynamic, that conflict between the two. And thus, Israel finds itself blocked, not by Palestinian resistance alone, but by the diplomacy of a supposed friend. So what was intended as a grotesque ethnic cleansing plan has backfired spectacularly, collapsing under the contradictions of allied agendas. Israel and Taiwan have long maintained close but unofficial ties. Representative offices were established in 1993. Bilateral trade reached $2.67 billion in 2022, covering areas like agriculture, science, technology and cybersecurity. Taiwan has studied Israel's civil defence, while Israel has eyed Taiwan's semiconductor expertise, the electronics experts as the Taiwanese are. Yet contradictions still run deep. Israel recognises Beijing, not Taipei, and has been careful to cultivate China as a trade partner, therefore won't ever actually recognise Taiwan. Taiwan knows Israel will not formally recognise it as well. In 2024, when Israeli operatives used Taiwanese-branded Gold Apollo pagers in covert attacks on Hezbollah, yes, that incident, Taiwan was embarrassed by it, but Israel just brushed it off. The relationship is a pragmatic and transactional one. And again, it reinforces the fact that non-recognition of states makes them vulnerable to exploitation. It's against this backdrop that Taiwan's Somaliland diplomacy has become especially awkward. Israel cannot openly pressure Taiwan without jeopardising quiet cooperation, nor can it engage Somaliland without entangling itself in the China-Taiwan rivalry now. So once again, the contradictions make the relocation scheme completely untenable, as it already was before, but now even more so. Taiwan's government is aligned with Israel, condemning Hamas and voicing solidarity, yet Taiwanese civil society shows more sympathy for Palestine, as is so often the case. Student rallies in Taipei in November of 2023 displayed Palestinian flags and condemned genocide. Indigenous activists in Taiwan have drawn parallels between their own history of dispossession and the Palestinian struggle. And this divergence is important. Officially, Taiwan stands with Israel, but in practice, Taiwan's Somaliland diplomacy indirectly shields Palestinians from relocation. By giving Somaliland alternative recognition, Taiwan obstructs a scheme that would have deepened Palestinian dispossession. In doing so, Taiwan's actions align more with the instincts of its grassroots than its government's rhetoric. But I'm of a mind that this is purely incidental. The lesson of this episode is stark, though. Ethnic cleansing cannot succeed even on its own cynical terms. Israel's relocation fantasies collapsed under multiple pressures: local resistance in Somaliland, regional opposition from Somalia and the African Union, global entanglement with China-Taiwan rivalries, and the contradictions of Israel's own alliances. And many of these difficulties will remain where it comes to other African nations as well. The grotesque absurdity of treating Palestinians as exportable cargo, like sheep or cattle, collided with the messy realities of geopolitics. Israel's plan for Somaliland has imploded, not only because it was morally repugnant to begin with, but because the machinery of international politics will not bend neatly to genocidal designs either. And actually, even international law has been taken out of the equation here to demonstrate this point. Even those of a supposed ally, as it turns out. In Gaza, Israel has sought erasure. In Washington, officials colluded with exploring relocation. In Africa, governments were approached, but in Somaliland, another story ended up unfolding. Taiwan, one of Israel's unofficial allies, cultivated a partnership that is inadvertently blocking Israel's genocidal plan. The irony is biting. Israel's scheme to export Palestinians collapsed not because of Arab states that they claim to be persecuted and terrorised by, not because of global outrage at their genocide either, but because Taiwan's diplomacy made it blow up in their face. One of Israel's friends did more to prevent relocation than many who claim to defend Palestine overtly. I'd certainly argue that includes the likes of the EU and UN spokespeople here. This episode shows that ethnic cleansing is doomed not only by moral law, but by political contradiction. Even allies backfire, even friends obstruct. In trying to export Gaza's people, Israel found its plan imploding under the very alliances it thought it could rely on. The Palestinian people cannot be erased, not because the world is just, but because even the realpolitik of power contains too many wires crossing for genocide to pass smoothly into solution. Something I suppose we should all be grateful for, actually, but it's not enough on its own. And difficulties and problems, if both parties are determined enough, could be overcome still. So this doesn't let Israel off the hook. That they even tried deportation, that they're still even floating this idea, should damn them still in itself. Of course, being a friend or ally of Israel doesn't necessarily mean anything at all, does it? As Jordan appear to be learning to their cost now. Benjamin Netanyahu's Greater Israel plan might not reach as far down the African coast as Somaliland, but Jordan is in the line of fire very much, and the reintroduction of national service there implies they know it too. So get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.